Hi, this is Mrs. Wiederholt, and welcome to my lesson video on conic sections, parabolas. Now let's get started. First, let's go over some definitions. A parabola is the set of all points in a plane that are the same distance from a given point, called the focus. And they are also the same distance from a given line, called the directrix. In this video, we will not be discussing the focus or the directrix. That will be for another video. Now, if you remember from quadratics, the vertex is the minimum or maximum point on a parabola. And it is the axis of symmetry that is the line that goes through the vertex that cuts the parabola into two symmetrical halves. Now, you might also see this referred to as the line of symmetry. They mean exactly the same thing. Now let's look at some of these things on an actual graph. First, we're going to look at the vertical parabola. Now the vertical parabola is the graph that we used when we discussed and learned quadratics. First, let's look at the equation. We have y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. Now this is a parabola that opens up if the a is positive. The graph would look something like this, where the vertex is at a minimum because the parabola is opening upward. Now your parabola will open down if the a value is negative. This graph would look something like this, where the vertex is at a maximum because obviously the parabola is opening downward. Now let's discuss the horizontal parabola. First, let's look at the equation. We have x equals a times y minus k to the second power plus h. Now if you notice that y equals from the vertical parabola and the x equals, the x and the y have switched places. And then if you look inside the parentheses, instead of x minus h, we have y minus k. Now this tells us something. It tells us that the vertical parabola and the horizontal parabola are inverses of each other. So the horizontal parabola opens right if the a value is positive. Its graph will look something like this. Here's your vertex on the left side, and it opens towards the right. Now, a horizontal parabola opens left if the a value is negative, and its graph would open towards the left and have a vertex on the right side. Now let's look at an example of an actual equation for a vertical parabola. The example is y equals the negative of x plus 2 squared minus 6. Since the a is negative, this parabola will open downward. The vertex is the h value and the k value. So since we have x plus 2, our h value is negative 2. And our k value is negative 6. Now remember, you can tell your axis of symmetry from the equation. It is going to be the h value. Now that is for a vertical parabola. It is the h value. Since vertical parabolas open up or down, the axis of symmetry is a vertical line, which would cut through the x-axis. Therefore, the equation would be x equals negative 2. Now let's talk about the domain. Now remember, for vertical parabolas, they open upward or downward. Therefore, their domain is always going to be negative infinity to positive infinity. And the range will always be the k value to infinity, or if it is a parabola that opens downward, it would be negative infinity to the k value. So since ours is has a negative a value, our range would be from negative infinity to negative 6. Now remember, I put the bracket around the negative 6 because our range does include that point at -6. So it doesn't go just up to -6. It goes up to and includes -6. Now let's go ahead and sketch this graph. Now the first thing I need to do is find the vertex. Now please forgive me if mine is not exactly perfect. It's kind of hard sometimes on this, but I did pretty good, did pretty well. Anyway, so there's my vertex. Now because my A is negative, I know it opens downward, and so it's going to look something like that. Now it's easy to see that if this graph were to continue, it would go forever leftward and forever rightward. Therefore, we have negative infinity to positive infinity for the domain. But it starts, if you could say start, you can't really start at negative infinity, but we go from negative infinity all the way up to and including -6 for our range. Now, let's go ahead and look at the horizontal parabola. Now remember on the previous page, I told you that vertical parabolas and horizontal parabolas are inverses of each other. So keep that in mind when we talk about the axis of symmetry, the domain, and the range. Now let's get going on that one. In this example, we have x equals y minus 5 squared minus 3. Now in this equation, the a is positive, so that means our parabola will open to the right. Now let's talk about the vertex. Now remember, the vertex is the h and k value. However, because this is the inverse, do you notice what's inside the parentheses? It's not x minus an h value. This is y minus the k value. So in order to put our h value first in our vertex, we have to look right here. That's your h value now. So our h value will be -3. And our k value would be +5. Now let's go ahead and sketch this graph. We have enough information to do so, and I think it would be make it a little easier for you to discover the axis of symmetry, the domain, and the range. So we'll start out with our vertex, which is -3, +5, which should be right about there. And since I know the A is positive, it will open to the right, so it will look a little like this. Now, since our parabola is opening towards the right, that means if we wanted to cut this parabola in half, we would have to do a line that would be parallel to the x-axis, meaning it's going to go through the y-axis. And where does it go through the y-axis? But where the y equals 5. So our axis of symmetry would be y equals 5. And if you notice, the axis of symmetry for this horizontal parabola will always be the k value. Y equals the k value. Now for the domain, remember domain is from left to right. And so this domain starts right here. So our domain is not going to be negative infinity to positive infinity, but it's going to be from this point right here towards infinity. Well, what is this point? Or we should say, what is the x-coordinate of this point? It is -3. So our domain will be from -3 to infinity. And our range would be from negative infinity to positive infinity. Now I hope this video helped you review a little bit about vertical parabolas, and I hope that it helped you understand a little bit about horizontal parabolas. And I look forward to working with you again. Bye-bye.